Okay, I wanted to analyze another one of my Blitz games online. This was against a player, rated lower than I, so wasn't I was expecting to win the game, but I thought there was a nice move in the middle, and that's why I wanted to put that up. It started off with a Sicilian. I was playing the black pieces, e4, c5. He played d3 over here, but I guess that's also one of the variations of Sicilian, although usually you play knight f3 over here. I continued with my normal Sicilian, knight c6. Then he played the rook pawn. He played a3. I continued with my normal central development because I like to put the pawn on d6 over here because I want to put my knight on f6 without having to worry about d5 kicking it out, e5 kicking it out, I'm sorry. He developed his rook pawns. Again, I see this very often on blitz games. I think they do that because they want to prevent the bishop from going to b4 or g4 in this case. I don't think it's a particularly good move. I think if you're white, you want to develop your pieces before your pawns, but you can do that if you like. I developed my knight. Then he wanted to fianchetto shadow the bishop. Again, this is clearly somebody, even with the white pieces, that was interested in counterattacking rather than attacking initially. I decided also to fianchetto shadow my bishop with, that's what I very often do in the Sicilian when I play my queen pawn, when I play my pawn to d6, I very often fianchetto shadow my bishop because otherwise the bishop is kind of hemmed in by the pawns in the black squares. He put his bishop on g2, so I put mine on g7. He plays his bishop, to a pretty natural development square. I guess he figured that g5 really wouldn't do much because the knight would not be pinned in that case. Now, I put my bishop on d6 because e6 here this would not normally be a logical move because I'm hemming in my e pawn, but over here I figured it was a lower rated player and I figured I wanted to use a tactic on him. I figured maybe I would move my knight away, let's say taking the d pawn or moving it out some other way, and then if he were to take the knight or to react to my knight move, I would be able to use my dark squared bishop to take the the b2 pawn and thereby trapping the rook. That's the reason why, really the reason why I put the white there, just because I saw a chance for a potential tactic rather than, I didn't really think it was a particularly good move early in the game, but it was a quick game. I figured why not? Let's go for it. Okay, he moves his pawn to c3, perhaps guarding against the trapping of the rook. Now, I moved my knight to the A file, to A5. Again, and not normally a standard move, not really a move that I would generally do, but over here, again, I thought that because of where my light squared bishop was placed, and because of kind of a weakness on his queen side with his pawn structure, I figured maybe I can get my knight into to b3 and see what I can do to develop over there. So once my bishop was already out there anyway. He kind of foreclosed on that by moving his pawn to c4. At least what I got him to use two moves to move his c pawn out. Normally, when you move your c pawn to c3, you're doing it in preparation to move your pawn to d4. So I didn't. So I moved my rook over again because I was a little worried about, similar to what he was worried about by moving his queen pawn up the last couple of moves. Is that again I was a little worried about my hanging B pawn, my hanging B7 pawn, with his bishop on the G, on the on the H1 A8 diagonal, was going to be able to take that pawn if the pawn in the center, if his E pawn ever moved away. Let's say if it moved up threatening my knight, if I took back, then he could take my G pawn. I'm sorry, my B pawn, and so I figured I'd protect it with the knight. He developed his knight, his second to last piece that hasn't been developed. I moved my G pawn, I'm sorry, my my A pawn up to A6 because I did not want his knight to be able to invade my territory. I figured if he moved his knight to D5, I could always trade it off with the knight or the bishop, but I did not want him to be able to move to b5. I figured it could be a little bit of a bone in my throat over there. He moves his pawn up, maybe advancing a little queenside expansion over here. Not exactly sure what the purpose of that move is. I didn't figure anything else to do, so I castled. He develops his last knight. So at this point, the pieces are pretty much developed over here. All 32 pieces are on the board. A very crowded, very closed board over here. Nobody really seems to have too many chances. Somebody's going to have to open up sooner or later. I move my bishop back, preparing the advance of the d-pawn, and also just getting it into a more natural square. Now that the diagonal was pretty much shut off by the c4 pawn, there was really no point in keeping the bishop over there. And again, it's not the kind of thing where you're worried too much about a tempo because there's such a closed position over here that it doesn't look like one tempo is going to make that big a difference. Now he finally decided to try to break open the center a little bit. He advances his e pawn, threaten my knight. Now I thought a little bit over here. I only had a few minutes, but my initial thought that it was a bad idea to take with my d pawn because then my c pawn hangs. So if I take and then he can take back with his knight, my c pawn is hanging. I can defend it with the rook, I can defend it with the pawn, but I think it exposes a little bit of a weakness for me. And also I wanted to stop hemming in my bishop. If you notice that knight over there, that knight on c6, I'm sorry, on f6, doesn't really have too many good places to go. I mean, here and here and here are all stopped by the pawns. That leaves backwards to d5, or I'm sorry, that leaves backwards to d8, or over here to the h file, and I didn't really like that particular option. So I pulled it back to the h file. I pulled it back to the d file over here, to the e file, and to e8. He took, and I realized that he figured that he was going to gain a pawn out of this. Well, you see that in a minute. He took. I retook with my pawn. I didn't want my c pawn to hang. Now he moves his pawn up over here. He moves his d pawn to d4. Now, if I take, then he can retake with his queen or his bishop or his knight, and my isolated pawn on the d file is very, very vulnerable. That's pretty much going to fall. If I do that, if I take back with the pawn, I pretty much guarantee that I'm going to lose a pawn because there's really not a whole lot I can do to to protect that isolated d pawn. And even if I protect it for the time being, in the long run, it's going to be a major weakness for me. So I figured I didn't want to take. Now I guess I could have protected it with the b pawn and taken it that way, but again, then I'd have an isolated pawn on the a file. I decided instead to move my knight back, figuring that if he took and if he were to take the pawn on the c file, and I took back and then he retook with his bishop, I would be able to move my rook over to the d file with check, and therefore this pawn, which is hanging, and I can take it any time, I'd be able to take that then, and it would be even in terms of pawns, and it would be a good for me because of the fact that my rook would now be centralized on the d file. His king either would have to move, or he'd have to take a developed piece and move it back to defend. Let's say his knight, he'd have to move back to defend, and that's exactly what happened. As a matter of fact, he played d takes c5. I also took d takes c5. He took it with his bishop. I moved the pawn over with check.